Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Abby. In February of 2024, I purchased the final braids that I needed to spin this Traveler hoodie as part of the DRK Spin It to Knit It Traveler Cal. By that November, I finished knitting it, and you can watch a vlog of me finishing it right before Thanksgiving. So for the majority of 2024, I was working on spinning and knitting my first sweater spin. And in this video, I'm finally going to analyze what I did to spin for the Traveler, explain what was successful, what didn't work, and my overall thoughts on this pattern. And after I talk about this project and specifically what that was like for me, I'm going to do a Q&A style section where I answer a lot of the questions that I had as a beginner spinner wanting to successfully spin for a sweater without ruining all of this expensive fiber that I bought. Basically, I just wrote down all the questions that I remember having as a beginner, and there were a lot of questions, so I condensed them down and combined them into different categories, and I'm just gonna go through those questions and answer them as best as I can now. And I want to be clear that this video is going to be from my perspective. This is not a tutorial or a how-to on how to spin for a sweater. I have only done one sweater spin, so I'm not trying to be an expert here or anything. And as always, there are so many different ways of doing things. So I just want to share my experience and try to give some thoughtful answers to questions that I had that took me a lot of trial and error and time to figure out. And I'll also be sharing resources that I found helpful, so I will round those up at the end. So these will be books, articles, videos, other online resources, as well as YouTubers and Instagram accounts, people who I find very inspiring and who I've learned a lot from, and kind of picked up niche things that are hard to Google, or maybe I didn't even know to Google them in the first place. Okay, so let's dive into my project details, because I have been wanting to talk about this since I filmed that vlog and told you that I would be coming out with an additional video on my sweater spin. So the Traveler is a pattern series by Andrea Mowry, and when she came out with the hoodie version, I immediately knew that I wanted to spin for it. I had heard some spinners talking about how this garter stitch-like texture was good for beginner spinners because it can hide inconsistencies. I had already been knitting with my hand spun for a while at that point. I learned to spin in December of 2022, and I had already experimented with a spin to knit project where I spun to get a specific yarn for a pattern. So with that as sort of a proof of concept, I was pretty confident in spinning for such a big project, but I still had a lot of questions and knew that I had a lot of things to figure out first. In my mind, a large spin is split up into two major projects. So there's the spinning part and the knitting part, and I'll talk about how my spinning went first, and then I'll get into what it was like to knit this pattern and just my thoughts on this pattern. I started with a single braid of Pullworth that I purchased at a Fibre festival. At that point, I had not bought much fiber, so none of this existed. I did not have a stash. But when Andrea Mowry announced the Spin It to Knit It Cal, I knew that I wanted to try to incorporate this braid of fiber into that sweater spin. And I ended up finding that dyer online and purchasing 2 more braids, but I knew that I wanted to do a combo spin, so I didn't want to just buy however many braids I needed of a single colorway. So I found some other fiber that I thought would pair well with what I had, and I bought 3 additional braids of Falkland from Wee Chickadee. I purchased that from La Mercerie when they were doing a big fiber update, and I think that they stock fiber more consistently now. So I had 6 braids of fiber, and 3 of those braids were 5 ounces and 3 were 4 ounces. So I had a total of 27 ounces to work with. And I also found an additional braid that was in a totally different color that I thought would work well with my colors if I needed more fiber, and I ended up using about half of that braid. And I did buy fiber for the drawstring as well. I probably used up less than half an ounce. So my size in the Traveler Hoodie called for 1900 yards of sport weight yarn, and I'll go into some more details on how to figure out how much fiber you need for the project that you want to knit later in the Q&A section, but I actually needed quite a bit of fiber for mine. Because my grist was so low for a lot of my yarn, I ended up using more fiber than the general estimations told me I would need. So I was glad to have that extra braid, and it's always better to have extra fiber than not have enough. So in total, I spun 29 ounces, and I did end up with a little bit of yarn and singles left over, but not that much. Here's how much yarn I had left over, and these are the rest of the singles that I didn't need to ply. And actually I did spin a little bit of this on my Nano, so here is a tiny bobbin of singles. And then as I mentioned, I had quite a bit of the drawstring yarn left over. Let's talk about plying, because I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how I wanted to ply, and what I settled on was very simple. So I had 3 braids each of 2 different colorways, and one colorway was a heavier braid than the other. So I had 15 ounces of one color and 12 ounces of the other color. I decided to split each braid into quarters lengthwise. I spun those end to end onto one bobbin, so each colorway had its own bobbin, and then I plied the 2 colorways together. And I found that that distributed the colors pretty evenly throughout, with the caveat that 2 of my braids were from a different dye lot, so those came out quite a bit differently. I think the biggest difference, and I talked about this in that vlog, is that the body has some of this gold color and the sleeves do not, because that color just simply didn't exist in 2 of my braids. I was a little stressed about that at first, but honestly I don't think that it really is that noticeable, and I don't think it detracts from the overall look of the sweater. And since I had 3 ounces left over of one of my colorways, I plied that with the 2 ounces of my additional braid. So that helped maximize my yardage, and I just knit that skein kind of randomly throughout, but I didn't end up needing all of it. So with what I had left over, it's definitely possible I did not need those additional 2 ounces. I haven't weighed everything to figure that out, but I was definitely glad to have it because I was worried about running out of fiber. I was also still spinning as I was knitting, and it was a little bit of a chaotic way to do it looking back. But let's take a look at my spinning stats, because as I mentioned, I accidentally spun a lot of my yarn closer to a DK weight, and my grist was pretty off because of that. In total, I spun 4 skeins. 2 of them were large 600 yard skeins, and my yards per pound ranged from 1,025 to 1,225. So my skeins had a difference of 200 yards per pound, which is quite significant. And I was very nervous about this because I had heard a YouTuber talking about how their grist had changed a lot, and they knit one sleeve in one skein and the other sleeve in another, and they could feel the difference while they were wearing it. Like one sleeve was denser than the other, and they could feel air getting through one of them but not the other one, and I'm pretty sensitive to stuff like that. So I researched how much difference in grist is acceptable in a project, because I wanted somebody to tell me that I was under the percentage of what would be noticeable and everything was going to be fine. But I couldn't really find anyone talking about it. All I saw was people saying that you needed to have a consistent grist. So here's what I found with my project, and I would not apply this to all projects, but what I found is that my level of discrepancy in grist doesn't make much of a noticeable difference when I'm wearing the sweater. When I was knitting it, I could notice a difference. It was pretty obviously a different weight of yarn, but while I'm wearing it, I really can't tell. It's very comfortable and I don't think about it at all. So there is definitely a margin in which you can be off in your grist, at least with something that is very textured like this sweater, but what that limit is, I am not sure. My takeaway is that yes, you should aim to get as consistent grist as possible, but if it's not perfect, that doesn't ruin it or make it unknittable. I spun 2 samples and I knit both of them into swatches. My first sample was definitely closer to a worsted weight, so that was a sign that the way my fiber was drafting and the way it bloomed was producing a thicker yarn than what I was trying to achieve. But this is the first sample and swatch that I made. And because I knew that this yarn was too thick, I just used this as a color gauge and I really liked what I was getting. And it's funny because this looks very similar to my sleeve. So this color test was quite accurate because this is really very close to what I ended up getting with my finished yarn. My second sample I did knit into an actual gauge swatch, so I knit it in the round and it looks like this, but you can see that I started down here and as I knit with the yarn, it starts to veer in just a little bit. And so down here was closer to a DK weight, and by the time I finished spinning my sample, I was getting into the rhythm and got much closer to a sport weight. I decided to spin a 2-ply because at the time I wasn't confident in being able to spin a thin enough single to get a 3-ply sport weight, but 3-plies do tend to even out your yarn better, so definitely keep that in mind. I was aiming to spin my singles at about 30 wraps per inch to get a yarn that was about 15 to 17 wraps per inch. For a sport weight, Jillian Moreno, who I will talk about later, recommends 17 to 20 wraps per inch for a sport weight, which comes out to 13 to 1800 yards per pound. So my sport weight was on the higher end. As far as process and timeline, I spun 2 bobbins of singles, then I plied them together and finished that skein before I continued spinning. And I spun everything, including all of my sampling, over a period of about 3 to 4 months with some large breaks in between. If I did it over, I would try to spin it in a shorter amount of time to try to stay more consistent and keep that fresh in my mind. Obviously, we can't control what else is happening in our lives, but next time I am going to try to time my sweater spin over a period where I know I can devote a lot of my crafting time towards it. Another thing I would do differently is I would spin all of my yarn before I started knitting to reduce how much time there was between the first skein that I spun and the last skein. Another thing I wanted to briefly mention is the twist angle. This is something that I don't check very consistently and I don't worry about it too much because I find that once I figure out my thickness and my density, the twist angle kind of works itself out. But I do pay attention to it when I'm plying because I find it helps me ply more consistently. Now let's talk about the pattern. This is a well-written standard Andrea Mowry pattern. The Traveler is knit from the bottom up. You knit in the round until you get to the armholes. You do a bit of shaping for the dropped shoulder armhole. You knit the front and the back separately. You pick up for the sleeves and knit those in the round. And then the hood is worked as a pretty simple short row hood. The ribbing is all 2x2 and you use the tubular cast on and bind off. So you cast on for the body and you bind off for the sleeves, and to do the 2x2 tubular, you have to rearrange into 1x1 ribbing, so you do the little mini cables to twist your stitches. I know some people don't like the way that that looks. I do. I think it looks fine. So I stuck to the pattern for all of the finishing. This texture is fun to knit. It is sort of an elongated garter stitch. And I did see some people talk about how they found it hard to memorize. I didn't. I found it pretty simple to follow. And when you switch from knitting in the round to knitting flat to doing the short rows, the pattern writes out exactly what row you're supposed to be working. So I just found it quite simple. The hood is made up of just short rows, and I found it a lot of fun to knit. It is quite a significant part of the knitting, but I really liked it. Once you get to the casing, there are some trickier things that you do to encase the drawstring while you're binding off. But there are video tutorials on everything you need to do, and I actually didn't even need the video tutorials. I found the written pattern to be very clear. There's also a drawing in the pattern that illustrates what you're supposed to do. So if you're intimidated by the construction of the hood, definitely don't be. It was very simple, and if you've knit a short row sock heel, you've knit this hood before, and if you've done a folded hem bind off, you're good to go. I like the size of the hood. I find it cute and cozy, and I could definitely see myself making this pattern again. I've also thought about putting this hood on another pattern. One thing I would probably modify if I were to knit this again is the armhole depth. I find it to be a little too deep. Obviously, this is a drop shoulder, so it's going to be quite deep, but especially because this sweater is cropped, the armhole depth is just quite a bit of the total length of the sweater. Part of it is that this stitch pattern does grow lengthwise when you block it, but she does account for that in the pattern, and she gives you pre-block and post-block measurements, which is really nice. So I would just shorten this a little bit, just so that my sleeves weren't quite so oversized. And because I spun this worsted style, this sweater is heavy. I forgot to weigh it before I started filming, so I'll put the weight of the sweater on the screen. I've worn this sweater a lot at this point. It is one of my comfiest sweaters. I will throw this on when I'm not feeling very well. I just want to be super comfy, so I wear it a lot around the house. And I haven't de-pilled it yet, but I have noticed that it's getting to about that point, especially under the arms where you expect to see pilling. But it's really not that bad. This has held up very well. And I did look this up because I was curious. So Polworth is 3/4 merino and 1/4 Lincoln. And so it's very soft, and it has a short to medium staple length. And then the other fiber that I used, Falkland, has a longer staple length. So I do think that it balances the yarn's softness with the durability. And I think it ended up being a really nice combo. So that's pretty much all I have to say about this project. Like I said, I did film a vlog where I go into more depth over some of the details, but those are my thoughts now that I have worn it a bunch and had some time away from making it. And now I want to get into answering some of the questions that I had as a beginner spinner. And again, a little disclaimer, these are not the only answers. I'm not an expert. These are just things that I have figured out as I went along. The first question I remember having is, where do I buy fiber and how do I find dyers and distributors? So of course you can Google this and find a lot of dyers that way, but I wanted to know who are the favorites, who are the tried and trues. Basically, I wanted to know who are my favorites, and I found a lot of dyers from the people who I follow who spin, and just looking at who they follow and where they source their fiber. I have a spinning folder on Instagram where anytime I would come across fiber of any type, I would save it so that I could go back and figure out like what type of dyeing style I liked and what type of fibers I was drawn to figure out the dyers that I wanted to follow more closely and keep track of their shop updates and all of that. And I've also come across smaller or just less popular dyers at yarn festivals and shopping in person, so that's a great way to find them. Just to get you started, if you don't follow any spinners yet, I'm gonna include a list of a bunch of popular hand dyers that I am aware of and who I follow. There are many, many more, and I haven't purchased from all of the ones that I'm going to list, so just keep all of that in mind, but hopefully that list will kind of get you started and just being aware of like who is dyeing fiber, and once you find a few that you like, you can look at who they follow and who they interact with and find more that way. Along that same note, it can be really helpful to look at people's personal fiber stash. A spinning channel I've learned a lot from is Wool to Gold, and Brian did a video of his fiber stash a while back, and I learned of so many new dyers who I'd never heard of. Another question I had is, what type of fiber should I start with? And I think the two main things you should pay attention to are fiber preparation and fiber content. As for preparation, the two major types are carded and combed. Carding is a fiber technique that people often do by hand, and it's where there's a lot of air in between the fibers and the fibers are not laying in the same direction. So you tend to see these as bats, roving, rolags. Combed fiber is usually aligned, so all the fibers are parallel to each other, and you often see this commercially processed as combed top. Traditionally, carded fiber is spun woolen style using long draw, and combed fiber is spun worsted style using short forward draw. And short forward is generally an easier technique to learn, so that's why people often recommend combed top to beginners. If you are confident, I think you can learn any technique, but I did learn short forward first, and I do think it's easier. At least it's easier to learn. And as for fiber content, you do tend to see a lot of merino in hand-dyed fiber, similar to how you see a lot of hand-dyed merino yarn, but there are a lot of different fibers, and I often hear spinners talking about how they don't love to spin merino, and sometimes it's a little bit harder to draft, so I definitely recommend checking out other fiber types. Fibers that I consider to be pretty accessible to beginners are Targhee, Blueface Leicester, Falkland, Rambouillet, Corriedale, Polwarth. And as a beginner, I would stay away from plant-based fibers like linen, cotton, bamboo. Those just tend to be more challenging. A huge question I had at the start is, how much fiber do I need? I think it's easiest to estimate this from weight. So if you are starting from a pattern, look at the yarn requirements, figure out the weight it calls for in grams, and then add a buffer of about 50 to 100 grams to account for sampling and any inconsistencies you might have like I did. If you don't have a pattern in mind, the book Yarnitecture has a table with estimated yards per pound for standard yarn weights and gauges. For example, you can estimate how many yards you would need for a DK weight sweater and your size, add a gauge of 4 stitches per inch, and reference that table to figure out how many pounds of fiber you need. A lot of people will buy 6 braids of fiber as a general guideline, so they would be spinning 24 ounces for their sweater spin. But it all depends on what weight you're spinning, what size sweater you're knitting, what type of sweater you're knitting, what your gauge is. But I do think that once you've spun for your first sweater, you will get better at estimating how much you need, and you can have a general guideline for yourself, which is helpful when you are just buying fiber, say in person, and you don't want to do a ton of calculations. Another question I had is, how do I decide how to construct my yarn? Handspun yarn is made up of a few factors: how you prep the fiber, how you spin the yarn, and how you decide to ply. And often how you ply will inform how you prep the fiber and vice versa. There are endless ways to spin fiber, so I'm not going to list out a bunch of options. Instead, here's the method that I use to figure out how I want to spin something. If I'm starting with a pattern, I will generally try to spin my yarn as closely to the yarn that's called for in the pattern, and I'll usually just let my colors do whatever they're going to do as I spin. So if the pattern calls for a springy 3-ply sport weight yarn, my default would be to split the braid lengthwise into 3, use short forward draw to spin my singles at about 30 wraps per inch, and then ply all 3 of those together. But if I'm not starting with a pattern or I want to do something different, I will usually try to incorporate a technique, whether it's something new to me or it's something tried and true. For example, when I spun for this hat, I wanted to try a fractal ply, And when I spun for these socks, I wanted to preserve the color striping, so I chain plied for the first time. As long as you're achieving the weight of yarn you need to knit at the gauge you want, you are likely going to be successful. I had a lot of questions at the start about combo spins, and the first one was just, what is a combo spin? Because sweaters and shawls and other large projects require so much fiber, people will often combine multiple types of fiber and different colored braids together to maximize how much yardage they can get without having to have the exact same type of fiber. Traditionally, I think a combo spin was a fairly specific way of combining fibers, and I think it's sort of grown to be a lot of different things, but the first example is, let's say you have 6 different braids and they're all different colorways. You would break each of those braids down into chunks of fiber, you would mix all of the fiber up together, and then you would just start spinning, possibly randomly from your mix of fiber, or maybe you separate it out. You spin equal amounts of each single and then you just ply those together. Another way to combine braids is what I did for my Traveler. So I had 3 braids of 2 colorways and I plied the 2 different colorways together. Jillian Moreno has another idea in Yarnitecture, which is full of amazing spinning ideas, by the way. Where if you want to make a 2-ply, for example, you would ply together 2 singles of your first colorway, 1 single of each of the first and second colorways, 2 singles of the second colorway, 1 single each of the second and third colorways, and then 2 singles of the third colorway. So kind of a lot, but you get the idea of just adding in your next braid with your next single. Another question I had is, how do I sample to knit a swatch? Sampling is where you just spin a small quantity of your fiber in the way you intend to spin it for the rest of your project, so that you can quickly create a small skein that you can then knit from before you spin the rest of your fiber. So you would go through the whole process that you would normally, just on a much smaller scale. You would spin your singles onto separate bobbins or onto the same bobbin if you want to use a center pull ball to ply from. You would then ply your yarn, you would put your yarn on a niddy noddy, you would soak your yarn, snap it and let it dry. Whatever you're gonna do to your final yarn, you wanna do to your sample, of course, and then you can skein that up and knit from it. One thing I was a little bit in my head about was how much fiber to spin so that I could knit a swatch, but I wouldn't have too much left over so that I was wasting it in case I decided to spin my yarn differently than my sample. To this, I would say now, like, just don't worry about it so much. Like, spin a small quantity, don't go overboard. You know, you have that extra fiber built in that you planned for, so you're gonna be okay. And also just look at this step as part of the process. It is an essential step. It's not an additional thing that you can waste fiber on, because if you're using that fiber to experiment with, then it is just part of the process. I also had a couple of questions about color management. So the first one is, how do I combine different variegated braids together? You may have heard the term muddied yarn, where you combine different colorways together and they're either not distinct enough or they don't blend well together, and you come out with muddied colors. I'm gonna link an article that shows you 9 different ways of combining braids without muddying your yarn. But a simple way to think about it, and this idea is from Yarnitecture, is to combine braids that all have one color in common. And this tends to work out really well. At the start, when I was planning my combo spin, I really wanted to figure out, how do I know if my colors will look good together? There's not really a foolproof way to predict how your yarn is going to turn out, so this is where sampling and trying different techniques comes in. One thing I've noticed is that carded and blended fibers tend to look different spun up than they would if they were combed, and I'll link a Reddit thread where people are discussing how to predict what blended top would look like spun up. Something I do for fun is I look at spin cycles colorways and I try to find a yarn that has the most similar colors to my fiber. Spin cycles yarn is usually spun fractally, so I might get a totally different effect depending on how I'm spinning, but they have a lot of colorways, and when I was sampling for this sweater, I noticed that my yarn was looking very similar to their colorway Rusted Rainbow. And so I looked at projects on Ravelry that were knit with that yarn to just get a sense of what my sweater would end up looking like. Again, it's not exact, it's just something that I think is fun to do. Moving on to the actual spinning process, the next question is, should I spin everything before I start knitting? As I talked about with my Traveler, I do wish that I had spun everything before I started knitting, but there is not a should here. I started knitting as soon as I had a finished skein, and then I pretty much knit with whatever skein I had just finished. So you can do whatever you want. There's not a right or wrong. I don't think that it significantly impacted like my finished project that much. But just for the sake of being able to stay consistent, remember what you were doing, I do think it's better to spin your yarn without too many big breaks in between. And if you do spin all of your yarn before you start knitting, this will let you do some skein management to figure out which skein you want in different parts of the sweater, which if you have a lot of colors in your combo spin, I think that's pretty important. Next is, how do I organize and keep track of everything? Keep a notebook or even just a note on your phone with your stats and your spinning plan so you can reference it while you spin. I've used several different things. I started out with a basic spreadsheet. Then I moved on to using OneNote, sort of like GoodNotes, so that you can incorporate photos and drawings and more stuff. It's more of like a note-taking app. But I also just jot stuff down on my phone all the time. I'll make a note and maybe go back and add it to my more organized system later. But the point is just to keep track of basic things with each project you do, which will really help you when you are either wanting to use that yarn later, you're wanting to recreate it, or you wanting to learn from things. And I definitely recommend creating a simple template, so that'll cut down on how much time it takes you to keep track of all of these things. It really doesn't have to take long. As far as physical things, I use a spinning cart to keep everything together, and I'll just wheel my cart to wherever I want to work on my project. I like to keep all the fiber for my current project on it, as well as baskets for each braid that I've prepped, and I'll use sticky notes or other types of tags to note what each braid or nest of braid is so that I make sure I don't forget. I also like to start a Ravelry project for each handspun project. Ravelry has a huge database of handspun yarn, and they have project pages that are specific for handspun, so it really is pretty easy to track. And you can also use your handspun in a project later, and it links the two. So whether you're going back to look at your projects or somebody else is looking at what you've done, you can pretty easily find a lot of inspiration there. Next question, what is grist and how do I check it? Grist is how many yards you've spun per pound of fiber. It's a way of calculating how thick your yarn is relative to its density. You can have two yarns that are the same thickness, but if one yarn has more air in it, it's going to behave differently. So you want to make sure that your yarn is the same thickness and the same density. And that's really all you need to understand about grist in order to maintain it across multiple skeins. If you are spinning the same thickness with the same twist angle using the same technique, you're going to get a yarn that's quite similar in grist. The way that Yarnitecture describes it is, if you want to raise your yards per pound and get a finer yarn, draft with less fiber per length of yarn, and then the other way around as well. So if you want to lower your yards per pound and get a thicker yarn, draft with more fiber per length of yarn. And you want to check your grist once you're completely finished with your yarn. So it's off your bobbin, you've soaked it, and it's dry. So this means you won't be able to use grist as an indicator when you're in the middle of a spin. You'll have to wait until you've finished that skein to check it. There are ways of figuring out your grist using a length of yarn, but I am not quite consistent enough to do that. So I like to figure out my grist when it's still in a hank. And to do this, I calculate my yardage by multiplying the circumference of my hank in inches by the number of wraps. And then I take that number and I divide it by 36 to get the number of yards. Once you have your yardage, you take your number of yards, you divide that by the number of ounces in your skein, and then you multiply that by 16. Or if you like to use grams instead of yards, you can take your yardage, divide that by your grams, pounds in your skein, and then multiply that by the number 453.592. Both of those calculations are going to give you your yards per pound or your grist. This next question is, how big of a skein can I make? And this might be common sense for most people, but I saw a lot of people skeining off their yarn before they had filled their bobbin, and I wasn't sure if there was a disadvantage to making like a mega skein. Because if I don't have to cut my yarn into multiple skeins, I would prefer not to. And I think the answer to this question is simple. It's just that you can make as big of a skein as your bobbins will let you. And actually, you can even make bigger skeins because you can spit splice together yarn from multiple bobbins if a single bobbin won't hold all of it. But the point at which this starts to get cumbersome is when your hank is not going to fit comfortably on your yarn swift. So you don't have to limit your yardage if you have a continuous strand that you don't want to break, but keep in mind that caking up giant skeins can get pretty unwieldy. Plus, those huge skeins are not as aesthetically pleasing if you're going to be sharing photos of what you're making, but really it doesn't matter, and I was just overthinking things. Okay, 2 more questions, we're almost done. The next one is, how do I fix my yarn if it's not what I want? So if your yarn is underspun, you can just put it right back through your wheel or your e-spinner to add some more twist to it. It's pretty simple. I had to do this with my first skein. And you can add more twist even after you've soaked it. Just make sure that you soak it again to set the twist. If your singles are overspun, I would say go ahead and try plying them, because when you ply, you are twisting in the opposite direction and you're spinning out some of the twist in your singles. And if your plied yarn feels overspun, definitely soak it, because that will relax the twist. If after all of that it is still overspun, which personally I don't think I've ever seen, you can run it through your wheel or e-spinner just in the opposite direction. But if you've made it as far as creating yarn, it's probably not overspun, because severely overspun yarn is essentially unusable. It starts curling up on itself. And the last one is a big one. It is, how do I know what wraps per inch to spin my singles to get a specific yarn weight? The only answer to this question that I have seen is to multiply your finished yarn wraps per inch by how many plies you want. So if you wanted to spin a 2-ply yarn at 11 wraps per inch, you would spin a single that's around 22 wraps per inch. But I found 2 caveats to this. The first is that when you soak your yarn, it's inevitably going to bloom and it's going to get thicker than it was when you first spun it. The second is that every wraps per inch gauge that I've seen doesn't list out every single wraps per inch. So for example, mine doesn't have 22 wraps per inch, it has 20 and 25. So if I was trying to get 22, I would be guessing and trying to get somewhere in the middle. So what I have found works for me is I take that general guideline of multiplying your desired wraps per inch by how many plies you want, and spinning that a little bit thinner, rounding down to whatever is closest on my wraps per inch gauge. So let's say that I want to make a 3-ply yarn that is 9 wraps per inch. 9 times 3 is 27, so I would aim for my singles to be about 30 wraps per inch, and I find that that leaves enough room for blooming. I have spun a lot of yarn that is thicker than what I wanted because I wasn't accounting for the blooming that happens, so just be aware of that and always sample your yarn if you're really trying to get a specific yarn. Lastly, I just want to share some of the resources that I have found really helpful. So I've already mentioned in this video Yarnitecture. This is, I think, the best book. I don't own every book on spinning, but I found so much useful info from that book, and it walks you through so much, and there are pictures of everything, and it's just a really good book. Other books that are on my list to check out are the Fleece and Fibre Sourcebook to start understanding fiber and sheep breeds better, and the Spinner's Book of Yarn Designs by Sarah Anderson, another great book with just a lot of info on how to spin yarn. There are also a lot of fantastic YouTubers I follow, so I will have a list in the description below of all of the people that I have learned a lot from. Again, there are many, many more, but I do find it really helpful to just watch somebody work on a project, talk about a project, and just like pick up on little things that maybe I wouldn't have thought about otherwise. Ply magazine and Spinoff magazine are two online resources that as I Google stuff, articles from them will come up. And also check out the subreddit for hand spinning. People will just ask a lot of questions that maybe you have had, and that will spark a lot of discussion as well. I will also include a list of a lot of inspiring spinners I follow on Instagram. Again, it's not everyone, and there are so many great spinners out there, so definitely don't take this list as a comprehensive list, but they are just people who I have learned a lot from and get a lot of inspiration from. And my biggest tip with Instagram is to look at who the people you like are following. I will try to link everything that I talked about in the description, but please ask any questions you have. If you have them, I might not be able to answer all of them, but other people might, and I hope that this was helpful.